Looks like it's recording. Wow. I'm going to put it up, I think. Up. How loud can you get? Anyway. All right. I have to go over here. And then go in here. And wait.
This podcast is proud.
Okay. I'm going to record this, and this is called Mission People in Alaska or something. The Conspiracy Show, the reality, something. The podcast. Wah. La la. How are you? Cow. Question. Intermix Hector YouTube. Subscribe. Intermix Hector YouTube. Subscribe. I live in Illawarra, New South Wales, Australia. Soy chileno. I love you too.
A connected universe portal, respectively. Haunted Road Media is also his own paranormal and supernatural book publishing and video production company, representing a number of paranormal authors.
Oh, fuck you too. You other planets, spaceships, never made anything like UFOs or fucking spaceships or technology advance. Oh, lie. Keep your secret, is it? Oh, my fucking God.
But whole live stream, what a great name. And the Connecting the Universe interactive class through the Connected Universe portal, respectively. Haunted Road Media is also his own paranormal and supernatural book publishing and video production company, representing a number of paranormal authors, winning the award for excellent media in the paranormal field at the 2019 Shockfest Film Festival. And he's also, as if that's not all enough, what a busy man. He's the author-editor of a number of books, including Alaska's Mysterious Triangle, Deadly Airs, The Inscription of Evil Times, Ghosts of Maryland, Ghostorian Case Files Volume 1, Ghosts and Legends of Oklahoma, Encounters with the Paranormal, Campfire Tales, Midwest, and A Walk in the Shadows, a complete guide to shadow people. Wow, Mike Ricksecker, you're a busy man. How are you?
Doing pretty well, Richard. I really appreciate that. Yeah, pretty busy. It's been a long week, and I just got back from a 3-day event, the Parapsychon event down at the Ohio State Reformatory. So, but yeah, still going. Had to jump right on here and talk with you this evening, and I'm really happy for that.
Oh, likewise. Great to have you. Are you in Alaska?
No, I'm not in Alaska. I did spend 3 years up there. 1992, 1995, when I was part of the U.S. Air Force, and then for the Alaska Triangle television show, it was a real treat that they flew me back up there so that we could film the show.
And the Alaska Triangle, geographically, can you kind of give us the configuration or the border?
Yeah, absolutely. It stretches from Juneau, which is the southernmost point, up to Anchorage, right in the middle, and then all the way to the northernmost. Yukiavik is the name of the town. It used to be Barrow, but they changed the name back to the native Inuit a few years ago. And it encompasses about 180,000 square miles.
Wow, 180,000 square miles. Most of it wilderness, I'm guessing?
Yeah. Alaska's pretty remote. It has Juneau, Anchorage, Fairbanks is in the middle there. And those are really the three major cities in Alaska. It's a very sparsely populated state.
How does that compare to the footprint of the Bermuda Triangle?
They're comparable, really. Excuse me. The dimensions, if you look at like the angles of what they consider the triangles, a little bit different with Bermuda as it goes from San Juan to Bermuda, and then of course to Miami. Now, when we call it a triangle, we're picking three major points of an area that tends to have a lot of activity, but it's this activity stretches outside of those definitive boundaries. I mean, in other words, the boundaries aren't as definitive as those points.
And how far back do this unusual activity within the Alaska Triangle begin? How far back did you trace it?
Yeah, it's a good question, because Alaska's a relatively new state, and, been, we've been interacting up there since maybe the 1700s. Some of the reported activity that we've seen dates back into the late 1800s, but when you get into the Native Alaskan legend and lore and some of the activity that they reported, now you're talking back, hundreds, even 1,000 years. And if you get into, like, if you look at some of the giant lore that the Native Inuit have, now we're talking tens of thousands of years.
Tens of thousands. And what is the first documented, recorded, let's say, disappearance, plane disappearance in the mysterious Alaska Triangle?
Yeah, some of these date back into the 1920s. I don't remember the specific date offhand. I think it was 1928 where one of these planes went missing. Of course, you're talking an older, archaic airplane. But some of the more significant ones, 1950, a Douglas Skymaster carrying 44 Air Force personnel went missing completely without a trace. The most famous one was the 1972 Boggs Begich disappearance, which was carrying House Majority Leader Hale Boggs at the time, as well as Alaska Congressman Nick Begich. And so you have some really high-profile cases there, but planes go missing quite often up there. And in fact, I was just talking with a person this weekend who had a family member whose plane went missing many years ago, and they still, have never found a trace of it.
You mentioned Boggs. Hale Boggs was also a member of the Warren Commission that investigated the JFK assassination. He was one of a lot of people think, the Warren Commission was a slam dunk. It was unanimous. No, I think it was it 4-3? Hale Boggs was one of the dissenting voices, and some have tried to make that connection that Hale Boggs' plane disappearance was, somehow connected to his views on the Kennedy assassination. Now, there's also a legend, Mike. I don't know if you can weigh in on this or not, and I don't know if this is an apocryphal story, but it's often repeated that the person who drove Hale Boggs to the airport before he disappeared was William Jefferson Clinton. Have you heard that story? Is there any truth to that?
I don't know if there's really any truth to that, but since you're on the conspiracy theory aspect of this with Hale Boggs, yes, he dissented against the Warren Commission. He made some enemies in the political circles, and so there was an interesting report that came out a few years ago. It was actually fairly recent. It was maybe 8-10 years ago. And there was an individual who came forward to give some information about some different nefarious acts and crimes that he had partaken in Alaska way back in the day. He was getting older and wanted to fess up. And he talked about a lot of different crimes. One of them, however, dealt with the Hale Boggs, Nick Begich disappearance, in which he stated that his job, he was taking up all these different side jobs. And one of them was to load up some sort of briefcase or package onto that airplane. Just put it on there, walk away, which is what he did. Of course, the plane disappeared. Somebody had informed him later on that this package actually contained an explosive. And so people wanted a reinvestigation of this case. The authorities never went anywhere with it. Their stance was that, we scoured that area. It was, at the time, it was the largest search and rescue mission in U.S. history. They even had spy planes out there looking for this wreckage, which there was none. It just completely disappeared. And since then, we're talking 50 years ago. In 50 years' time, other planes have either gone down or gone missing in the area, and they have never found any scrap whatsoever of the Boggs Begich plane. And so they said, if there was an explosion of this plane, at some point we would have found some shrapnel or pieces of metal or something to give us some evidence that this explosion happened, and they never found that. So take for it what you will. Was there really an explosive on that plane that brought it down, or was there some other means that it just completely disappeared?
16,000 people have mysteriously vanished in Alaska. Most of those in planes, or how?
No, it's an assortment. You have a lot of people, and some of these disappearances, are just legitimate. People do get lost in the woods. They get mauled by a bear. There are kidnappings, things like that. The number 16,000 it's a high number, especially for a very sparsely populated state like Alaska. You're talking, Alaska as a state has about roughly the same population as the city of San Francisco. So there's not a whole lot. I mean, San Francisco is a large city in a very large state, but Alaska itself, does not have a lot of people. So 16,000 is a high percentage of people that have gone missing, and some of these, are actually rather public. So I know David Paulides has done a lot of work here on people that go missing in the woods, and that happens up there as well. But a pretty famous case back in 2012, Michael LeMaitre, it was during what's called the Mount Marathon Race, which is held in Seward, Alaska every year. And he went running up the mountain just like everybody else, never came back down. They have no idea what happened to him. Again, they scoured the areas. They're thinking, okay, did he fall off the path somewhere, hurt himself? They never found any evidence of him anywhere. I have no idea what happened to him in the middle of a public race.
What is the when you spend time inside the triangle? I mean, is there a noticeable change in energy? I mean, do you get a bad vibe when you step foot inside the triangle? What's it like?
Well, I mean, when I first stepped in the triangle, this is 1992. I was pretty well shocked. I mean, I was a young kid, so I was I was getting kind of shell shocked anyway, of being away from home for the first time and all that. But when I first stepped off the plane, it was November 1st, 1992. A couple months beforehand, Mount Spur across the Cook Inlet from Anchorage and Elmendorf Air Force Base had just erupted. So there is still ash falling from the sky, kind of mixed in with the snow. Which was just a real culture shock for me. We're having to cover up computers and things like that at night so that the ash wouldn't damage them. A lot of earthquakes up there. The energy itself is really palpable. It's the U.S. Department of the Interior in 1965 did a survey up there covering about 100,000 square miles. Now Alaska itself is over 600,000 square miles. So they only covered about a sixth of the state, but it's still a pretty sizable chunk. And in that 100,000 square miles, they detected what they called these magnetic characters, and 5 distinct ones. And within these magnetic characters, they described, in some cases, negative anomalies. So this is, our government conducting scientific surveys of the land and finding this strange magnetism that's there. You also have the what's causing the aurora borealis, which is the solar flares from the sun. And around the poles of our planet, the magnetic shield that protects us from these flares is thinner, which is why we see a lot of these auroras. And the strong ones penetrate even further. And every 11 years, we have those mass coronal ejections that people talk about. Could wipe out a entire electric grid. So really you have this whole soup and cocktail of these different energies, seismic, volcanic, the magnetic energy welling up from the ground, as well as the solar flare activity that just cause some really strange things.
Good I love you. Technology advance, technology advance, technology advance, technology advance, technology advance.
Science.
The unexplained, space and the cosmos.
Bias, or ethnic bias, or your own personal bias. That there's an implied bias that exists. As hard as you try to not be biased, you have an implicit bias of some kind, and you have to be aware of it, and you have to acknowledge it, and then that allows you to see it and to free yourself of it. And my implied bias is that I think a lot of what we see is human. And I remember years ago there was a radio transmission that was floating around for a while, and it was from the eastern frontier in Russia, and they had the air defense network had detected some kind of high-speed object that penetrated Russian airspace. And I think this is kind of germane at the moment, unfortunately. But at the time, the Russian air defense, they sent up a MiG-29 to try to chase it. And so this guy gets up there, and I had the communication translated by somebody who actually spoke military Russian, not just Russian, military Russian, which is a very rare thing to find. But basically, like, the guy gets up there and he sees it on radar, and he's like, okay, I'm going to chase it. And so he's chasing it, and it's climbing, and he's climbing, and you can imagine this whole thing goes back and forth. And finally, the colonel, this comrade colonel that is running this operation, he finally tells the guy, he's like, look, just get a radar lock on it. Let's just blow it out of the sky. I'm done with this, right? And the guy goes, okay, I'm a major. I'm following orders. So he gets a radar lock on it. And I guess that kind of irritated whoever was flying this thing, because he said in the radio transmission, because he's calling back, he said that it had banked. And he had a visual on it. He could see it. And it kind of banked and pointed toward the southwest, toward NATO, right? And it accelerated. And the speed at which it accelerated, he couldn't match it. He said that he was at full power on his dual afterburners on his MiG-29, which is a little antiquated at that time, but still plenty fast. And he's got that thing at full afterburner, and he couldn't even catch it. And it was out climbing him, and he lost it. But you think to yourself, right? You have to keep all the possibilities on the table. It's aliens, it's us, whatever.
Sure.
Number one, why would an alien fly toward NATO? And number two, why would an alien fly toward NATO?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But what that shows you is that some NATO country, not necessarily us, it could be England, it could be France, it could be, the Norwegians, the Danes, whoever. Somebody had some kind of a sophisticated drone, I would imagine, because of acceleration, a drone that they were flying into Russia, and this thing could outclimb a MiG-29. It could outpace a MiG-29, and it could outmaneuver a MiG-29, and it could also scramble the radar on a MiG-29. So that made me think, well, maybe that one was human, because it's behavior. And I think what a lot of people miss is behavior. That when you watch a UFO or a UAP or USO or whatever, because remember, you and I both know, right? There's 1,000 different types.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. They make posters of them, for God's sakes.
I have those on my wall here in the studio.
I have my Bob Lazar poster. but they, there are a bazillion different kinds. But I think that you have to watch the behavior of it. Because when I was young, when I was in college, and I really started, to do this stuff, I went to UC Davis, and there was a town called Dixon. And one night, my girlfriend and I, we went out to the cornfields the day after mass sighting, and we thought, well, we're not going to see anything. Well, we watched 14 of them dogfight for a good 2 hours until they came down low and came toward us, and we kind of looked at each other like, I'm not getting abducted by aliens, and we left. But the characteristics that I saw, they were not something that a human could do. I mean, it was making squares, one was making circles, and then one was making triangles, and then it was making rectangles. And then they would fly around like they're dogfighting, and just a lot of high G turns that no human could survive, I think. So you have to observe it, and you have to see what it's doing. And then you can start to ascribe a kind of methodology to, okay, well, where does this come from? And by the way, one other thing, since I'm talking too much, when you have RF signals, this is germane to the DNI, the head of DNI. When you have RF signals like that, when those military ships those Navy ships are detecting the RF. They can intercept that stuff. And if you can intercept it, you can decode it. Now, it might be encrypted, but you can still decode it. And so I bet you they have a very good idea of what's in those RF transmissions. Because if they're set in the clear, like a lot of satellite stuff is, if they're set in the clear, it's all right there. All the telemetry, it's, RPMs on its turbines, whatever it's doing, it's all there. So I think they probably have a very, very good understanding of what some of those UAPs were. But I forgot to mention that.
But again, to your point, I mean, isn't it somewhat telling that often we see video released, less often we see radar data, less often do we see these systems? And of course, the explanation, and I'm sure it's valid, well, we don't want to release that data because it would say too much about how those systems operate. But then again, if they're also collecting data that tells something else that they don't want the public to know, that could be another reason that information is withheld. We are already knee-deep in a fantastic conversation with Olav Phillips. He is a writer, he is an author of many books, and also a publisher. We'll have information about what he publishes and where you can find it online, available in the show notes. But when we come back after this, Olav and I are going to dig a little deeper into mysteries involving outer space. Are there indeed secret aspects of the space program that have been left out of the history books? I'll get Olav's take on that when we return here on the Micah Hanks program. Every so often. And for X subscribers, there will be some additional time spent discussing Fortiana, secret aerospace developments, and other mysteries with Mr. Phillips. If you aren't already a subscriber, of course, you can head over to micahhanks.com/podcast. Okay, and right there in the upper right-hand corner of the page, you'll see X memberships. Click that. That'll get you where you got to go. We also have a link right there in the show notes, so you can access that from your podcasting app. But it's just $7 a month or $77 a year, and that gets you full access not only to this show, but also the weekly X podcasts, the monthly Enigmas specials, and the entire back catalog of the program, all on your own unique RSS feed for just $7 a month or $77 a year. It's a great deal, and it's a great way to support the content that yours truly produces every week, much of which is made freely available to the public for their listening entertainment. But with that, it's time for us to get back into this conversation. Olav, another question, I guess, on my mind, and I want to run this one by you here in light of everything we were just discussing, is, if these objects are our own, what does it mean when the Department of Defense continues to call them unidentified publicly, and then also launches investigative elements like the UAP Task Force, the AIMSOG? They're using taxpayer money, they're collecting data. Does this convey that they don't know what some of them are, but then there are others which fall into the UAP category, which are, again, what we might call known unknowns?
So that's a very interesting question that has a lot of levels. And the one thing that maybe makes me different than a lot of people who look into the whole UFO UAP thing is that I do function from the point of view that there is such a thing as national security, and some of these things need to be secret. And I think that to release all the footage, it would compromise the sophistication of some of our data collection. So as a taxpayer, I'm actually totally okay with them keeping some of that stuff secret, if it's for national defense. I think that's important. But And notice that almost never, right? You get night vision, but almost never do you get thermal. And I guarantee that some of those aircraft have thermal. And I think the thermal would tell you a lot about what it's doing. But I think, I think that they do. Back, what the A-12 was, the original SR-71?
Right. And please, if folks at home aren't familiar with that, can you give us a little bit of the background? Yeah.
Sure. Most people know what the SR-71 is. It's now decommissioned, but it was a very high altitude, vast. I think it has a world speed record from like New York to London or LA to London, whatever.
Yeah, still holds that record. Yeah,
still holds it. I think that was officially locked like Mach 2.5 or something, but it flew in excess of Mach 4, and it's very sleek, aerodynamic. Huge jet engines, very sophisticated plane. Leaked like a sieve, but that's because they would take it off and it would lose something like 40% of its fuel on takeoff because in order to handle the heat, it was very loose, and so the fuel would like drain out. So they had to like refuel it again once they got it airborne, and they could heat up the skin. Very sophisticated aircraft. Well, originally, when that thing was developed, the CIA had gone to Lockheed Skunk Works and said, okay, we need a spy plane. This U-2 thing ain't going to cut it. Because the U-2 is a glider, basically.
Right.
It's a glider with a rocket engine. And the idea behind the U-2 was that it could fly so high that nobody could shoot it down until the Russians proved us wrong with Gary Powers. They blew it out of the sky,
Yeah.
Right, and so they wanted something fast that could literally outrun a missile, and so they built something called the A-12. And the A-12, I actually saw one at the Boeing Museum up in they call it something else now, but up in Seattle. Boeing has a museum, and they have an actual A-12, not an SR-71, and it is substantially bigger. It is a much bigger plane, right? But also it's silver. It is not black. And they hadn't worked out some of the paint and other stuff, but it was silver. And so what was happening is that when they would fly this thing, right, you can imagine, Joe Bob in the late 50s when they were testing this thing, he's sitting out in the back fishing, and he watches this silver thing streak at high speed across the sky. What are you going to think, right? You're going to think, whoa, that's a UFO, especially in the late 50s. And so at the time, the CIA kind of liked that, and they fueled it. They would fuel that narrative that it was a UFO, and at some point in the process, they started to realize that the KGB was actually sending out their they call them illegals, their resident our directorate. Mm-hmm. Basically, they're fake Americans, KGB Americans, right? From the show The Americans, you can watch it. Well, they would send these guys, these people, men and women, to various flying saucer viewing parties or whatever, and they would end up sending FBI or CIA to watch them. And so you had this kind of quid pro quo going on, where you've got KGB there, you've got FBI and CIA there as well. And they're all watching each other. But there have been many times when the DOD or just Lockheed themselves, they've tried to redirect what you're seeing and give it the alien tag, because, up until the last, say, 10 years, I think it really goes back to the O'Hare thing. That before that, if you say, well, I like UFOs, it's like, well, it's a death sentence. If you had a security clearance, you'll lose it. If you were married, you're probably going to get divorced. If you had friends, you probably don't now. But now, it's a pretty accepted thing.
Oh, yeah. You can go to a party now and you can tell people you study UFOs and they'll buy you a drink. It's incredible. I love it.
I know. It's crazy. You're like you say, hey, I saw Bigfoot. And like everyone's like, what? And everybody wants to talk to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, there was a long history of them covering it up with this kind of stuff.
Right.
And when you look at like Project Grudge or Project Blue Book or whatever, these were actual investigations carried out. But what you're seeing is the declassified component of it. I'm sure, given that AFOSI was the one investigating all those sightings for Project Blue Book, we usually think that, it was, Quintanilla and the other guy, they're driving around in a car. It's all like, Project UFO or, Project Blue Book from the TV series. Wasn't quite like that, actually. That most of the cases were investigated by AFOSI, which is it's the investigative service to the Air Force, but they're part investigators. You know, they are federally credentialed, FBI trained investigators, but they're also counterintelligence officers, and you know, they have an intelligence kind of background as well. So, and everything those guys do is classified. So I'm sure that the thousands of pages of Project Blue Book that was released, I'm sure there's 1,000 more sitting somewhere at Bowling Green or, you know, Wright-Patterson that's classified still, because they couldn't decide what it was.
Right.
You know, and again, you know, I think personally, my own kind of bias in it, I think that if they can't identify it, you know, we do have a right to know to a point, but if they can pretty much deduce that it's from a foreign agency, you know, it's probably in our best interest to still classify some of that stuff while they sort it out.
Well, certainly. You know, you mentioned the Blue Book files, by the way, Olaf, and you know, when you go back and you look at those, there are some interesting things that turn up from time to time. Around the time, I guess it was 1951 of the Lubbock Lights case, there was a very fast-moving, like 900 mile per hour object that was headed due north, and as it was approaching Washington, a ground-based radar station queried it with a identification friend or foe query, and it responded in the affirmative, friend, using the actual, at that time, classified IFF system that was in use by the U.S. Air Force. Now, the interesting thing is, back in the day of Blue Book, when that was still classified, they presumably wouldn't have released that information. And Ruppelt, in the report on unidentified flying objects, so much as said there was some data about that case that didn't get released, but the majority of it can be talked about. And here's the primary story. I suspect he was talking about that classified IFF component to it, but that did come out later. Brad Sparks and other researchers have looked at that. Was that a classified aircraft that was using the classified IFF system in use by the Air Force at that time? Or was it something else that had the ability to decrypt that signal and respond in the affirmative? Now, my guess would be, again, if we follow Occam's razor, like you say, my guess would be that we're probably dealing with a classified aircraft. But then the next question is, then what was that? Why was that never revealed, what that aircraft was that was in 1951 flying 900 miles an hour? Very interesting question.
Right. And I think that that's the crux of the problem, right? Is that, you know, there are certain aircraft that, as civilians, that we know about, right, that the military will admit to. And, you know, there's a level of belief about certain ones, whatever. But, you know, there's a lot we don't know. And, yeah, I mean, it makes identifying them very tricky, because it's like, okay, well, is that an SR-71, so to speak, right? So, you know, you don't really have any way to identify it. But I do, as I said, I do think that most of them, the vast majority of them, are misidentified, either civilian aircraft or military aircraft. And then a subset of that, I think, is probably some super sophisticated stuff that we're really not supposed to know about. Because there's a very famous recording. I'm still trying to find it. I heard it. I had it, and I lost it, and I got to find it again. But there's a very famous recording from Oakland, where Oakland actually controls a lot of the inbound flights from the Pacific for Northern California up to the Oregon border. And so one day, this guy, he was minding his own business, just a happy air traffic controller, and he gets a request. And the guy says, you know, I'm an unlisted military flight. And the controller says, okay. He says, well, I need you to clear me a flight corridor, because because the shock wave from from going to fast beyond Mach 1, there's a shock wave, and if a commercial airliner gets hit by that shock wave, it'll throw it around. It won't crash it, but it'll throw it around, and everybody will be very upset, and there'll be some injuries. And
sure,
you know, so they make these corridors, and so the guy says, "Well, I need a corridor," and basically he wants a corridor across California. The guy asks me, he says, "Okay, well, what range?" Or, you know, what altitude are you at? He says, well, I'm an unidentified military flight at 610, and that's 61,000, which is pretty darn high.
Yeah.
You know, your normal commercial jetliner is somewhere between 20 and 40, right? I mean, 40 is getting pretty up there too. But this guy's at 61, and he tells, and the air traffic controller says, okay, well, what basically, how big is your shock front? And so the guy kind of gives him a thing, and he says, well, I'm going to go up, so I need an altitude clearance of something like 61 to 100, 61,000 to 100,000. I need that clear. And the air traffic controller he's like, sure. He's like, 61,000 to 100,000. He's like, I got nothing. You go for it.
I was going to say, I mean, usually we don't have other aircraft operating up there, sir. But I mean, if you really want me to tell you it's clear, go ahead.
No, and like a Gulfstream will go up to about 52. A Global Hawk surveillance drone, probably 54, 56. They'll cruise at 54, 56. So, you get these kind of glimpses every once in a while that are kind of, because I focus on the public domain. I don't want to know. If it's not in the public, I don't want to know. So, you see these little glimpses of things like that. And then, you go back to the very famous speech at the Caltech alumni dinner. The head of Lockheed Skunk Works say, well, not only do I have the technology to take ET home, but I got the contract. So the fact that he would cop to that, that's a pretty significant thing.
I would certainly say so. And we're up on a break here, but when we come back, Olav Phillips, my guest, and I are going to be talking about another one of those controversial characters in all of this, a guy who claims to have actually worked on recovered extraterrestrial craft. What is to be made of the story of Bob Lazar? We'll see what Mr. Olav Phillips has to say about that when we return right here on the Micah Hanks program. Welcome back. It is the Micah Hanks program, and we're having a conversation this week with Olav Phillips. He's the author of several books, publisher of many others. We'll have information about where you can find all of his work and the books that he publishes online available in the show notes this week. But of course, I also want to ask you, Olav, as we're having this discussion about there being a secret side to aerospace development, and that maybe there are certain government agencies that know more, have acquired more, and that have definitely developed technologies that have been left off the books, so to speak. I have to ask you about Bob Lazar, and I'd love to get your take on Bob Lazar, his claims, and whether or not he is indeed who he says he is and did what he said that he did. What are your thoughts, Olav?
Well, I believe him. I met him back when I was in college. And, I went to Desert Blast, and I sat in his house as he was running shockwave propagation models on a DEC Alpha 8, which at that time was a pretty powerful, mini mainframe, basically. Like a mini supercomputer, It was the size of a refrigerator. And, he's just sitting in there. We're just chit-chatting. He's telling me about the rocket car, and he's running shockwave propagation models. That's not something that a normal person does, right? I mean, if he wasn't an engineer, he sure put on a good show. I mean, talking to him, like, he was very genuine. I saw the bullet hole in the back of the Corvette, right, with my own eyes, that Dennis Mariani supposedly was shooting at him and clipped the back end of his Corvette. But, what really impressed me more than that was his knowledge of engineering. And I remember, after all the fireworks and stuff were done at Desert Blast, he brings out the jet car, and he's got this jet car, and he's trying to light a bonfire with a jet car. I mean, who does that, right? I mean, he's got a jet engine, and he's trying to punch the turbine to light a bonfire. But I'm looking at this jet car, and he had a turbine engine from an F4 Phantom, and he built a car around it, and he could run it, And then I saw there was a guy, he gave this guy a rocket backpack. And basically the guy was riding around on a mountain bike with a backpack that was a rocket engine that Bob had built. I mean, he put a rocket engine in a CRX. He put a jet engine into a Lincoln. I think it was a Lincoln or an Aries K car or something.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's like, you don't just do that. Like you can't just build a jet car. I mean, I maybe you're a wonderful mechanic, but there's so much more going on than just aircraft, the engine, and being a mechanic. You know, you've got to deal with torsion, and you've got to deal with torques and stress, and it's a very sophisticated thing to do to build a jet car or to build a rocket car. I mean, he seriously mounted a rocket engine in a CRX and could drive it. And that's not trivial. This isn't Looney Tunes, and you don't mount a rocket on the roof strapped down with bungee cords. And
hello, new technology, blah, blah, technology. We go in the next episode. Love you, question. Listen, reply. Adios, amigo. Go, whoa. I love you. Family. God. Family. God. I love you.
Recently that showed that, about 72% of people are focusing on ability. It's becoming a corporate-wide initiative, so much so that it's showing up in annual report filings and being reflected upon in terms of the assignments of the employees from the executive levels all the way down.
Got it. And so seeing the companies that are doing well have more of a high-level executive mandate, I'm dying to know, and certainly have our hunches, and we do a lot of interviews here, but your take on what has gotten them to that point. I mean, for me, to this day, at least at the time of this recording, a C-suite that sort of has a coherent picture of what AI can and can't do, and of where sort of longer term, maybe even 5-year, maybe even longer, it can help really support them winning in the market and serving their customers and their teams is rare. It's still rare. But some are obviously far enough along. What are they doing to get on the same page there? Because there's a lot of growth for most firms to get to that level of competence.
Yeah, I mean, for us, what we've seen is, we've taken on a lot of that burden of, kind of helping to consult and educate with our partners out there. A lot of people have a coarse-grained view and opinion of, what AI is and what it can do for them. But sometimes, with less expertise and knowledge, that view can be a little bit overly optimistic or just, off center. And so really helping to define, what it is AI can and can't do for you, and, how we can help to actually drive business value is pretty interesting. The way people are kind of looking at business value and measuring ROI is another area that's really changing over the last few years in terms of what people are looking at and what they're measuring.
Maybe we can get a little bit into that. I mean, we certainly have very, very strong opinions about this, but when you look at the again, more and less savvy folks from a how do we measure ROI vantage point, what leaps to mind in terms of separators there?
Well, I think, just to overly simplify it here, there's two ways to think about this. And a lot of people really are bound to that traditional mindset of how they think of measuring, new technology adoption and new purchases, which is, how much is this going to help me save, in terms of time or money or staffing and resources. It's a cost savings viewpoint.
Yep.
To me, that seems fairly short term and fairly tactical. And oftentimes, if that is the equation you're going to use to measure the return on investment, it won't make a lot of sense, right? You've got to have a longer view of it, a more strategic view. And so where we're seeing people really doubling down and really kind of investing heavily with fortitude and conviction is where they're looking at this from a very different perspective, right? It's how is AI going to help to drive and power the next set of services and products that we deliver? How is this going to help us to improve our customer experience and customer retention? You know, measurements like that are really tied to bottom line revenue generation seems to be the more strategic view that we're seeing in people who've kind of really matured in their mindset and their strategies and execution around AI. What's interesting is, you know, Samanova commissioned some research recently that showed that, you know, about, 72% of people are focusing on cost savings versus 67% on revenue growth. That was last year. I'm pretty sure that we're going to see that level off and then continue to tilt towards revenue generation and away from the tactical cost savings as we go forward and people mature in their thinking.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that we see AI almost 4 years ago even being synonymous with just automation or efficiencies. Slightly more mature, maybe thinking about other kinds of risk. But yeah, moving forward, the folks that'll arguably see the largest returns, and certainly they'll be able to keep up as entire industries start to transform in the decade ahead, will be the folks that can open up new capabilities. Again, whether that's revenue, new products, etc. Takes a while to get there, though. Again, there's a certain amount of executive fluency to sort of make that level of a commitment and calculate it in some other way. In terms of painting a big enough vision to see where can AI connect the dots, the reason that, Marshall, I think it's easy to look at the efficiency play is because we don't need to understand anything new. We just need to understand the current costs of our current workflows and ask some simple questions about percentage reductions of X, Y, or Z, and then we're done. If we want to imagine a new way that our medical device or a new way that our manufacturing plants or a new way that whatever our product is can serve the customer or can provide additional feedback data to the company that can help us improve efficiencies in some other way. You know, in order to see capabilities erupt, we need a much bigger sort of amount of fuel for our imagination. We need to know the technology, be able to see what it's doing. What helps people see that bigger picture from your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you're spot on, right? I mean, the cost and efficiency thing is really easy to look at because it's just incremental, right? And when you're talking about new services and new products that you can provide to your end users, that you're talking about exponential change. You're talking about transformation, right? And so, how do people really shift to that? I mean, I think a lot of this is daring to be bold and think out of the box and just realize that AI is not going to drive, if done correctly, going to drive incremental change. It's going to drive exponential transformation. I mean, Dan, we love our car analogies in this business, right? This is the old saying that, if Henry Ford had asked, prospects what they wanted, they would have told him a faster horse.
That's it.
Right? They would not have said they want a car. And so it really is, truly understanding that, this is, exponential transformation that AI is going to drive. And, we look back to the one of the more recent big transformational shifts, which was the internet, right? The internet didn't take off overnight either. And, I'm sure at one point, all of us looked at a primitive website and said, gee, this is great. I've got a research paper that I can read on my computer. What good is the internet for other than that? Well, it turns out it was good for a whole lot of things. And I think that daring to explore and innovate is really what's going to drive, the end results of AI. I think we're just at the early days here, and I don't think we've imagined everything that it's going to be over the next 5 to 10 years yet. Not even close.
I do think that being able to see the current traction in use cases does help to open up that imagination, though, Marshall. I'm sure you would agree. A good set of use cases, knowing what different companies are doing, this gives us a better bounding box of where could this take us? What is realistic in terms of capability expansion? To your point here, in terms of that daring to innovate, obviously, quite an important element here. We have our Kodaks that didn't get into digital. We probably have oodles and oodles of retailers that didn't get on the web and they paid the price. Similarly,
probably the people that really made the most of it weren't just daring to innovate with a big technology wave in all ways because they thought it was cool. They probably dared to innovate in a way that really was a worthwhile, deep investment in their core competencies. Are you seeing smarter companies that are moving ahead with this stuff think very deliberately about where to make these deeper AI improvements? Because it's pretty clear if I'm a $20 billion manufacturing company, there are borderline unlimited number of places where I could spend money improving data infrastructure, hiring talent, improving team collaboration, thinking about new predictive models, thinking about physical automation. It's unlimited. What does it look like to take daring innovation, but also be deliberate and strategic about it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. What we're seeing, especially in, forgive me for the term here, but for, more, stodgy or traditional enterprises like banking, right? I mean, let's face it, banking hasn't really changed all that much in 200 years.
No, it has not. No, it has not.
You either have money or you need money, which is why you go to a bank, is what one of my close partners has said. But that's all going to change, right? And so, there's been a great focus on, just how do we improve and expand the customer experience? How do we better and more uniquely engage and differentiate the services that we provide to the end users is what these folks are thinking, to the point that many of these companies who have the word bank in their name today believe that in the future they may drop bank from their official name, because banking services may only be one of many supporting services which they provide to their end users. And so they're in a true transformation. And we have numerous examples of this, from the internet days where, companies completely transform from their core competency and installed base to something, very different. It was quite a metamorphosis over time.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see where those go. And again, I think for folks steering companies, it's a very deliberate choice in terms of where you want to start that big innovation engine, because there's a lot of places you could start, but I think if you're smart, you pick the right areas. And to your point, Marshall, many of the stodgier industries will struggle with that, but they should be deliberate about still getting it done. I can certainly agree there. Last point I'll touch on, because you guys had a pretty substantial customer success story in Europe. One of your big banking, we're talking about banking here. One of your initial big sort of releases from a customer story standpoint was in Europe. Clearly doing a good deal of business in the United States, hiring a lot on both sides of the Atlantic here. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing from an adoption difference from Europe and the US, if there's a way to kind of put it in a nutshell in terms of what's maybe different.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are some contrasts between North America and Europe and Asia Pacific as well, where we also operate. But from a European standpoint, the European countries and the EU in particular, they're very advanced in terms of data privacy and data protection, rules and regulations which have been put in place. I would argue that they are, leading the world in that and really putting the impetus on vendors and suppliers to adhere to what's probably the future state for the world, given their leadership in that space. Another area where we see a lot of leadership coming out of Europe is around sustainability, right? And this is something that we all as inhabitants of this planet should care about deeply. And, AI and large language models and the training of those certainly has its implications around sustainability in the environment, which we all, bear a responsibility for, which is being enforced, by a lot of European nations and countries. And then finally, the other thing that we see evolving very quickly in Europe as well as in Asia and other small countries is just the adoption of AI being coordinated at national scale versus just company or corporate scale. And that requires a whole different level of engagement and partnership with vendors to do it right. And, something that we've been very, very proud to be a part of, and something that we see as a huge opportunity to really jumpstart AI fluency and AI native business and governing in these countries that take on those initiatives.
Yeah, well, I think so. This is a good sum up, and hopefully for our audience, this has been a nice way to be able to say what is unique about Europe. What's happening over there that might be a little bit different. Certainly, the countrywide AI adoption, very tough to pull off over here, Marshall. But if you're a Belgium or a Singapore or you name it, there might be a way to just improve infra altogether and improve policies in a way that sort of lift innovation with a national budget in a way that's more substantial, and that's kind of a cool possibility to think about. My hope, Marshall, is that we get to talk about, as that starts to get more and more mature and you guys get more involved there, we get to talk about that public sector side of AI as well. But there's a shot we'll see more of it in Europe than in the States. And I'm aware of where we are on time here, but I'm glad we're able to fit in everything and have you back in the program. It's been great to be able to chat again, Marshall.
Dan, thanks so much. It's an honor and a pleasure as usual.
And that's all for this episode of the AI in Business podcast. Great to chat with Marshall as always. I've been on many an online event with Marshall, an in-person event with Marshall, and he's been on the show so many times it almost feels just like another day in the office. And certainly he's seen a lot over the last 18 months. So it's great to be able to have him back on the show and share some ideas. Hopefully you learned a lot from today's episode. Again, this episode was sponsored by Samba Nova. Samba Nova believes that AI is here, and you can learn more about Samba Nova themselves at sambanova.com/AI-is-here, or just type into Google Samba Nova AI is here, and you can learn more about their initiative there, and also learn from some of the best of insights from our podcast series. They've been doing a great job of translating these AI is here episodes into individual articles and infographics that they've been sharing on social. And again, you can find that by finding them. If you yourself are interested in reaching the global Emerge audience, whether through sponsored podcasts, articles, co-branded research, demand generation, and more, you can learn more about Emerge Media Services, that is to say, the work that we do with AI vendors, at emerj.com/AD1. That's emerj.com/AD, as in advertise, and then the number 1. So that's all for this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. I look forward to catching you the next time here on the AI in Business podcast.
Oops, it's finished. Is it? Oh my God. Oh my God. My God. My God. Question. 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 I am intermix hector YouTube, subscribe. Intermix hector YouTube, subscribe. Question, 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 opinion, listening, reply. I love you, family. I love you, family. I love you. I'm intermix hector YouTube, subscribe. YouTube, subscribe. International Computer Network. Sexy, love you. I love you. I love you. Looks like it's recording.